Julian, and welcome to the Monday morning Introduction to Philosophy and Theory lecture. Today, I'm going to be giving you a basic primer, an explanation of Žižek's basic psychoanalytic distinction between hysteria and perversion. And I'm going to talk about how perversion is always the ideology of the status quo, of the powerful. And I'm going to be drawing upon an argument that Slavoj Žižek makes in the ticklish subject, namely on page 126 and 127, as well as an argument that he makes on page 455. But we can discuss that later. So, if you're new to this channel, welcome. This is a weekly lecture series. The current series that we're in is on subjective destitution, and it's basically a primer on Slavoj Žižek's philosophy and theories, and made accessible in a way that doesn't reduce the complexity. And these lectures are entirely free and open access for anybody who wants to join us. And if somebody would like to support my channel, then please check out my Patreon, where you can find audio downloads, a weekly bonus seminar that I record with people on Discord, as well as an ongoing ebook series. All right, thank you everybody for being here. Let's dive right in. So today I'm going to be discussing the difference between hysteria and perversion, and why Slavoj Žižek argues that perversion is always on the side of ideology and the status quo. And to break it down very simply, to give you a formula of sorts, hysteria is always on the level of doubt. Perversion always functions on the level of certainty. And Žižek's basic argument is that the contemporary, as he puts it, postmodern, polymorphous subject, who has the ability to do anything he wants to do with his life, or so he is told, is nevertheless anxious and depressed, and therefore looks for someone who can tell him how to live, how to be happy. After all, if the superego injunction in late-stage capitalist ideology is enjoy yourself, live your best life, then the question remains, how do I live my best life? This means that the postmodern contemporary subject looks towards master figures, figures of parental authority that are supposed to tell him how to live. And these master figures for Slavoj Žižek are always the figures of perversion, which is to say, the pervert is the one who claims to know how to enjoy, who claims to have the secret, who claims to have access to a level of enjoyment and experience that the subject is barred from. Be it a self-help guru who tells you the secrets of how to become rich, be it someone like Jordan Peterson or even Andrew Tate, who tells you the secret to living a successful life or being a true man. Be it anybody online who gives you some advice as to how to lead your perfect life. Here we have the figure of the pervert, the perverted figure who has or claims to have this secret knowledge that he is making available to the lost postmodern subject. Perhaps the quintessential example of this perversion comes in the 2011 comedy film Crazy Stupid Love, in which we have Steve Carell, who plays a middle-aged man undergoing a divorce, who finds a new friend in Ryan Gosling, a young, hip, ultra-masculine man who tells him how to be more cool, how to shed the skin of the castrated, middle-aged father and to become a cool, strapping, GQ-wearing man like Ryan Gosling is himself. And in this scene, if you can find it on YouTube, there's a wonderful scene where Ryan Gosling basically walks Steve Carell through a mall, telling him how to act and what to wear. It's essentially the YouTube logic of wear this, not that, or eat this, not that. You can see here in the movie the essential perversion of this ideology. Here's how you should act in order to be cool. Here's how a real man should be. In other words, the reduction of the subjective stance par excellence, namely hysteria, who am I to others and what are they to me, into a simplified formula of success. Do as I do and you will become happy, successful. You too will be a true man. Of course, the extension of this on an ideological level today is the manner in which these figures sell courses and protein shakes and various supplements that are supposed to help the lost postmodern subject find themselves. In fact, You could see even within action movies, there's a common trope in action movies where at a certain point, like yesterday I was watching the Netflix movie Extraction. Um, at a certain point, the action hero, who's usually a buff, macho male, will look at the person he is protecting, usually a woman or a child, and will say, "Do you trust me?" And this is the moment where the child or the woman, the protectee, has to say, "Yes, I trust you." And then the action kicks off and he kills everybody. This trope of "do you trust me" is the trope of perversion. Namely, I am the figure of authority who knows how to live. Do you trust me? Are you willing to give yourself to me? In fact, you can even see this in the movie Aladdin. One of the most memorable scenes in Aladdin is when Aladdin essentially sets Jasmine free. Jasmine is the postmodern polymorphous subject, the princess sitting alone at home. She has everything in her life, abundant luxury, and yet what she is missing is a sense of danger, a sense of what it means to have a purpose. Aladdin shows up at the palace with his flying carpet, invites her onto the rooftop, extends his hand, and says to her, "Do you trust me?" This moment of "do you trust me" is the moment of perversion par excellence. Are you willing to give yourself to me freely so that I will show you how to live? And Žižek's basic argument is that perversion always implies a liberating act on behalf of the subject, and yet nevertheless tacitly works on behalf of the status quo. Which is to say, Žižek argues that perversion and the perverted figure of authority, the perverted parental figure of authority, nevertheless acts on behalf of the status quo of the ruling ideology. In this precise way, self-help gurus, figures like Andrew Tate or Huberman, etc., are teaching you how to optimize yourself, applying a kind of biopolitics of the self that nevertheless functions according to the exact coordinates and incentive structures of contemporary ideology. In other words, there's nothing truly transgressive about these courses and these stances. They are simply teaching and promising the subject access to enjoyment so as to know how to live. Even philosophy, in its regressive pre-post-metaphysical stance, was essentially a pervert's art in this sense. It promised the lost subject of phenomenal experience a transcendental truth that might someday be known. In other words, the perverted stance of Plato's Republic is precisely this idea of the cave and the desire to exit it. The philosopher as the figure who guides others outside of the cave. It is with Kant, and certainly with Hegel, that the figure of philosophy becomes inverted. The philosopher is no longer the sage who can lead others outside of the cave, but instead the subject of a radical Cartesian questioning, a radical self-doubt. Namely, not simply the transcendental aspiration to self-transparency, the original promise of, or the original metaphysical promise of the Cartesian subject, but instead the hysterical scratching at the itch of what it means to know something if everything is to be doubted in the first place. But let us take a step back for a moment. This perverted stance for Žižek is contrasted with the hysterical one. I began this lecture by saying that for Žižek there's an elementary distinction between perversion and hysteria. Perversion exists on the level of asserted knowledge or certainty. I know how to live. I disavow the gap in the other. I am a subject of certainty, and I will sell you this certainty. The hysteric, on the other hand, is the one who cannot disavow the gap of the other. The hysteric is the one who must constantly question, is this real enjoyment? Am I really who I am? Am I really feeling what I feel? Imagine for a moment somebody who goes on a date and they have a perfect date together. Like they really hit it off. They talk about books and movies and they go for a walk and they eat ice cream and they have the same sense of humor, the same likes and dislikes. It's a perfect date. And then you go home and you think to yourself, is this really it? Is this really what love feels like? Here we have the hysterical questioning. What am I to the other? Is this thing that I am feeling really it? In fact, hysteria is the most common symptom of contemporary postmodern alienated existence. I have everything, I am nominally free, and yet somehow it feels like something is missing. Is this really it? This question, this kind of, I'm not fully happy with what I'm doing, is the hysterical question par excellence. And for Žižek, the assertion of hysteria, namely the radical questioning as to your own relationship to the other, is in fact the philosophical stance par excellence, which is to say, to radically assert the gap between you and the other is the pre-revolutionary gesture. It is how you begin to undermine and question what exists as given. Not to simply embrace it, to optimize yourself so that you might more readily fit into its incentive structures, optimize yourself, but instead precisely to make yourself someone who can't fully integrate, who isn't able to fully seamlessly blend in to social reality. For Žižek, this is the subjective stance par excellence, to embrace, as he puts it, the alienation that is inherent to the social reality as such. Now, let me take another step back. Let's talk a little bit about religion for a moment, because in a pre-modern world, religion presented itself as a kind of perverted ideology, which is to say, the basic premise was this: if life on earth is bad, you can always look forward to heaven. And if you want to make life a little bit better, you can look towards others, priests, Christ, the institution of the church, to teach you how to live. In other words, don't worry too much about your social reality and about the injustices of the feudal system. After all, the king is king by means of God's will, and his representatives are therefore representatives of the godly will. Do not question this. Instead, act in accordance with God, thereby acting in accordance with nature. Which is to say, the social hierarchy, the ideological institutions of the status quo, of the feudal system, were inherently made to be reflections of divine will, and thereby reflections of the common good. This meant that to question it made you heretic, essentially. You were questioning the divine will of God, therefore you had abstained the right to live, and you were to be killed and tortured as a symbol to others. However, strictly speaking, if one actually looks at the theology, one can see that the transition from the Old Testament to the New Testament is precisely an attempt to release Christianity from perversion and to embrace hysteria. Which is to say, the post-metaphysical shift that occurs in the New Testament, Christ on the cross, as Hegel puts it, what dies on the cross is not just the body of Christ, it is the God of the beyond, is the elimination of the transcendental perverse system by which all truth and wisdom and knowledge resides within the Godhead, and people on earth are simply the slavish subjects who have to be reunited with him. Instead, it is precisely God who appears fallible, God who falls so that we might rise, who rises thereby in us. In other words, after the New Testament, the Christian faith is no longer perverse. It's no longer the faith of the Ten Commandments that you must simply follow. Instead, it is radically doubt-centric. Namely, it is about the active participation of a community of the faithful who cannot claim to know God, but who instead must act in accordance with what they believe God's will might be. And Kant already pointed this out. Kant, this is of course much earlier, I mean, not earlier than the New Testament, but much earlier than what we're talking about in postmodernity. Kant already argued that, strictly speaking, if we knew what God wanted from us, and if we acted in exact accordance with God's will, then there would be no freedom, and there would be no ethics. After all, ethics is something which comes to us as a radical disruption of our supposed certainty as to how to act. Think about the traditional trolley experiment. Like, do you save a small group of people or do you save a large group of people? Choose. But of course you can't. It's an impossible forced choice. This is precisely where ethics comes into play. Ethics come into play when there is no right way to act, and therefore we must inquire at the very deepest level of our being how we would decide to make this choice. And yet, this is precisely the subjective stance. I don't know how to act. There is no guarantee that my action will be validated or legitimized, and yet I must nevertheless choose. This, for Kant, is the only form of true freedom. In other words, true freedom occurs on the level of hysteria, on the level of radical self-doubt. There is no external symbolic big other upon which you might hinge or place your responsibility. Now, to return briefly to contemporary times, Žižek's argument is that within the postmodern world, the big other essentially disappears, or perhaps he is displaced. There is, on the one hand, the existential assertion of the death of God, but perhaps more importantly, there's also the disintegration of traditional frameworks of symbolic authority, be it institutions of learning, be it strong parental figures who tell you how to live. There's an opening up that occurs within contemporary modern, postmodern life. You can live how you want. You are free to do what you will. We are more free and healthier than ever before, and yet also more depressed, also more alienated. And the trap here, a trap that is very readily exploited by figures such as Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate and Huberman and the likes of them, is that people want certainty. They want to know how to live so bad because the pain is so real. And so they regress to these figures, these supplemental figures of parental authority, who give them the certainty that they crave, thereby eliminating the pain of the gap between the subject and the absence of the big other, the absence of the guarantor of social reality, of justice and truth and wisdom and purpose, someone who will alleviate the pain of living an alienated life. And this trap is a trap that makes us less free, because we are happier. We are happier when we are perverted. Perversion is the contemporary ideology of postmodern life. And this doesn't even have to be a self-help guru. If you have a virtual trainer who tells you how many times to jump and how high, we have here the elementary logic of perversion. I don't have to do it for myself. I can simply follow the orders of somebody who tells me how to do it. AI, the integration of AI into a phone that claims to know you better than you know yourself, is the ultimate version of this logic of perversion. You don't have to think for yourself because the AI already knows it for you. Think about AI integrated into medical services. You don't have to diagnose yourself. The AI will do it for you. In other words, the promise that you will be saved from hysteria, that you will be saved from not knowing, from the uncertainty. This is precisely the ideology of perversion, which is the contemporary postmodern ideological power par excellence, according to Žižek. Now, there's a couple more things that I'd like to unpack here, but we've already introduced a lot. The basic distinction between hysteria, on the one hand, the radical questioning of the subject as to the other, namely, what am I to the other, what are they to me, versus the pervert, who essentially provides you with certainty. The pervert is the one who claims to know, the subject who is supposed to know on your behalf, who you can follow. One of Žižek's arguments that I think a lot of people are aware of, but often is a little bit misunderstood, is that Žižek claims that cinema is the pervert's art. So what makes cinema the pervert's art? That's what I'd like to focus on here. So when you watch a movie, you're essentially putting yourself aside for a moment, and you're living in an experience through somebody else, vicariously. It's exciting, of course. It's a very rich art form. To be very clear, Žižek is 100% pro-cinema. He is a cinephile. In fact, Žižek wanted to be a director before he became a philosopher. One of his arguments is that most people start with one passion in their life. They are not able to make this come true, and then they essentially transfer or channel this passion into their actual vocation. In other words, Žižek wanted to be a director, but he channels this into his work of philosophy, which is intensely engaged with cinema. And yet, why does Žižek refer to cinema as the pervert's art? Well, think for a moment about a sitcom. When you're watching a sitcom, there's usually like a laugh track, right? There's a laugh track, or at least old sitcoms used to have a laugh track. And Žižek says that when you're watching a sitcom, part of the pleasure of it is that somebody else is doing the laughing in your stead, which is to say you can enjoy it without having to laugh yourself. Somebody else is laughing for you. And here we have the fundamental logic of perversion. You don't have to worry about it. Somebody else is simulating it for you. You can have the simulacra of the thing instead of the real thing. Strictly speaking, this is also true for pornography. When you watch pornography, you don't have to deal with the hassle of finding a romantic or sexual partner and all the inconveniences that come with it. Am I doing it right? Am I enjoying it right? Etc. You can simply watch the simulacrum of it, thereby stimulating and arousing pleasure in yourself. And Žižek says that this logic actually holds true for most contemporary capitalist social relations, which is to say it is the ideology of the supplement instead of the inconvenience of the real thing. Dating online versus actually finding a romantic partner and all the inconveniences that applies. Even political correctness follows this basic logic. Political correctness implies that we can find one mode of addressing things, of speaking, that will be clear and inoffensive and unhurtful to people, instead of the mucky reality of communication, which is always, as Hegel already knew, miscommunication. Communication is the hysterical attempt to make up for what you might have said wrong or what might have been misinterpreted in advance. Before you even say it, you have already betrayed your original intention. You are self-censoring. Of course, the figure of the pervert is precisely the one who tells you to only ever speak your mind and to take no prisoners and to simply not bow to the political correct overlords, the woke matrix, etc. Simply be yourself and be a man and speak truth, etc. This nonsense is precisely the release from the tension inherent in all communication. What is it that I want to say? How will it be interpreted? And how do I overcome this gap? A gap which you cannot overcome. Therefore, communication is precisely this gap, asserted in its negativity, as Marcel Proust knew all too well in his In Search of Lost Time, which is essentially a radical way of addressing the problem of not being able to say what you want to say. But back to cinema for a moment. So Žižek's basic argument is that the contemporary postmodern subject wants a supplement that essentially gets rid of the messy reality of it, and that substitutes a fantasy by which the subject can directly inhabit it. Pornography provides you with the pleasure of the erotic experience without the messy circumstances of the encounter. A comedy with a laugh track provides you with the joy of laughing without actually having to do it yourself. And cinema functions in the same way. Cinema teaches us how to dream, how to live, how to make love, how to kiss. Cinema essentially provides us with an ideological framework by which we can situate ourselves in social reality. Which is to say, it's not that we, strictly speaking, imagine ourselves to be the characters. We nevertheless, it's not that we pretend to be the characters. This would be a kind of psychotic attachment. It's that we enjoy the distance between us and them. It's precisely the distance of the screen that allows us to sit in the dark, projecting our own desires and fantasies onto them, but perhaps crucially, it is their fantasies that are projected back onto us. We start living as if we were them. We start copying them. We walk like them. We speak like them. We dream like them. We kiss like them. And Žižek says that it's very important, therefore, to understand that cinema is one of the driving forces of contemporary ideology. The way in which social reality is constructed and envisioned within cinema directly reflects upon how we stage and imagine our own social reality. Now, this isn't simply a paranoid argument about the woke propaganda of Hollywood elites who are teaching us to live a certain way. Instead, it's a psychoanalytic argument about the satisfaction that cinema provides by giving us a phantasmatic frame upon which we can project ourselves so that we might not have to face the question of how to live ourselves. And so it's precisely not that the cinema gives us a guide how to live. It's that we can suspend the ethical necessity of having to decide how to live by means of watching others stage a phantasmatic life. This makes cinema profoundly resonant art form. It speaks to our own social reality, but it also shapes it. It also creates it. And I can talk more about cinema at some point if you're interested. And so what Žižek argues is that cinema is the pervert's art because cinema does it in our stead. And yet, unlike self-help gurus who claim to have the secret to self-optimization, which they can then share with us so that we might impose it upon ourselves, cinema doesn't demand this of us. Cinema doesn't tell us how to live. It doesn't tell us what's right and what's wrong. Instead, cinema explores the various dimensions of this ethical framework. And therein resides, of course, the pleasure of being a cinema-going audience. Now let's loop back to Hysteria for a moment, because I've introduced Hysteria, but I haven't really emphasized why it's so important for Žižek. So first of all, when Žižek talks about Hysteria, he's essentially reframing a Lacanian argument, a psychoanalytic stance on hysteria, which Lacan derives from Freud, but really changes quite a bit. For Lacan, the life force of the subject isn't to negate nothingness, which is to say, Lacan's not very Nietzschean. For Nietzsche, it's a fairly simple binary. We have nothingness and the will to nothingness, which is a kind of death, and then we have positive affirmation of the will. Here we can see how Nietzsche lends himself, of course, to a certain perverted stance. Reject the death force and embrace the life force, etc. Which is not true to Nietzsche, it's simply what's become of Nietzsche. Lacan argues against this, that the subject is precisely affirmed in his quote-unquote positive life force when he embraces nothingness. In other words, what the subject wants is not the thing, but the thing in its loss, namely lack. This is what Lacan characterizes, building upon Freud, as the death drive. The drive revolves around this nothingness. In fact, there's an argument that Žižek makes here that I think is easy to misunderstand, but he says, surplus enjoyment emerges precisely when we circle this loss as lack. And the example that he uses is an anorexic. He says, an anorexic isn't simply refusing to eat. An anorexic is eating nothingness as such. And this eating nothingness, therefore, is the surplus enjoyment that comes with the renunciating act. Namely, in a world in which calories are all too easily accessible, to not eat is precisely what provides surplus enjoyment for the anorexic subject. Now, of course, I want to note that this is, of course, a pathologization of what is a clinical problem. But it goes against the standard liberal interpretation that anorexia is simply about body issues, that we want to be like other people because they're skinny, and so we force ourselves not to eat to become skinny, etc. And while there might be a part of that, Žižek's basic argument is that this disavows the pleasure that comes from not eating. Namely, to put it in simple terms, what is the pleasure of eating compared to the pleasure of renouncing food as such? In other words, in the prohibition, the subject finds surplus enjoyment. And it is precisely in a world in which prohibitions are supposedly suspended, the society of excess, in which the surplus enjoyment of denying oneself comes out. And yet, for Žižek, here again, we have a perverted logic. The perverted logic is that we can't enjoy the thing as such. Instead, we enjoy the negation of it. In other words, you're enjoying the not eating. You're deriving satisfaction from the prohibition which you have placed upon yourself, which thereby gives you access to enjoyment, which you could no longer find in the thing as such. And Žižek's basic argument is that this is extended into all social life. Part of why it's so tempting to give ourselves to self-help gurus is because in the absence of parental systems and figures of prohibition, we struggle to enjoy. And so by means of placing restrictions upon ourselves, we are able to enjoy once again. We are actively enjoying this nothingness. A self-help mantra is always, whilst your friends are out partying, you could be at home working hard and making money. What's enjoyable here is precisely the punitive prohibition that you have placed upon yourself, the surplus enjoyment of the knowledge that you are moving forward in life while your friends are merely having fun. Of course, this hustle culture, this grind culture, lends itself perfectly to the recreation of capital in its own guise, which is to say, capitalism produces itself by means of creating capitalist subjects, subjects who believe that the ultimate form of enjoyment is therefore to work on behalf of the reproduction of capital. Hence, the capitalist subject is the subject of the return of symbolic prohibitions by means of parental authority so as to supposedly disavow enjoyment. And the irony is that capitalism creates this cycle precisely by means of creating a superego injunction, enjoy yourself. And so it is against the backdrop of the capitalist injunction, go out and have fun and live your life, that you stage a return to staying at home, grinding it out, to work on yourself, thereby reproducing capital. This is the double bind of the capitalist injunction, according to Žižek. Now, to return to Lacan. Lacan's basic argument, therefore, is that the subject seeks and actively enjoys this nothingness, the circular movement around nothing, which he describes as drive. And yet, for Lacan, hysteria is precisely what undermines this. Hysteria is the momentary assertion of why am I doing this? Žižek's emphasis on the Bartlebian maxim, I would prefer not to, is precisely the assertion of this kind of hysteria. Why would I do this? Do you really have the secret to happiness? Do you really know how to live? Why would I dress like this? Why would I eat like that? To question the incentive structures of the perverted enjoyment, the pervert's ideology, is therefore the preliminary stance of liberation and emancipation as such. And it's funny because sometimes I make videos here about I would prefer not to. And I often see comments that I think are sort of funny where people say like, oh, I'll walk out of a store and they say you should pay, and I'll say I would prefer not to. And yet this misses the point of I would prefer not to. I would prefer not to is now I get to live without social rules. I get to live a kind of free life in which I refuse to do what people want from me, etc. I would prefer not to is precisely the realization that what is sold to you as your emancipation is precisely the manner in which you remain unfree. Hence, I would prefer not to is the fundamental mantra by which you invert the world, the Hegelian topsy-turvy world. I was told I am free, and this is what makes me a slave. And yet, when I become a slave, I think myself free, and yet nevertheless, I am making myself subject to capital. In other words, it's a double bind. You're screwed no matter what. Either you're simply in the system, and you're screwed, or you're following self-help gurus telling you how to be free, and now you're screwed in a different way. You've simply learned to exploit yourself. Hence, one of the postmodern traps is that exploitation is now outsourced to the subject in the guise of his own emancipation. Why work for a boss if you could work for yourself, etc. And so for Žižek, instead of offering you another way out, another mantra, another 10 ways to live your life, another form of perversion, namely, I know better than you how to live, instead of providing the subject with this kind of security, Žižek wants to assert the gap between the subject and the certainty. Doubt and radical self-doubt as the affirmation of the negativity at the heart of social reality as such. It is only by means of embracing this hysteria that one can see and identify truth. Hence, for Žižek, building upon Lacan, hysteria is a truth procedure. It is not a truth protocol, but a procedure by which the subject realizes that alienation is precisely what contains the structural truth, the key, as to the conditions of his existence and exploitation. So rather than giving the subject a simple way out, it actually asserts this problem in its irreducibility, thereby achieving the potentiality of subjective recognition. Hence, for Žižek, hysteria is to be asserted. Hysteria is the philosophical stance par excellence. Certainty is the perverted stance. Certainty is the subject supposed to know, who is supposed to teach you how to live. Hence, all the self-help gurus are perverts acting on behalf of perverted ideology to reinforce the status quo whilst telling you that you are free. Whereas for Žižek, he will never tell you how to live. He will never tell you how to be free. Instead, he will articulate in painfully difficult conceptual terms the radical alienation at the heart of social reality itself in the absence of the big other after the death of God. And it is my goal in these videos to help you navigate those ideas in a way that is hopefully enriching to you, that provides value. And if you've enjoyed these lectures, please do consider becoming a patron. That allows me to help, that allows me to keep these lectures free. That is ultimately what it comes down to. Thank you so much. That is the pervert versus the hysteric. I'm going to be answering some of your questions in the bonus Discord afterwards. See you guys next week.